Visualeconomik community, as you are all aware, Donald Trump has declared trade war not only on one or two countries, but on the entire world beyond the United States. What has happened is unprecedented, and even if the president decides to backtrack, it's already too late. Many people viewed these tariffs as a negotiating strategy, a way to get other countries to sit down and negotiate. What's more, Stephen Miran, one of Donald Trump's top advisors, said we had just seen the greatest masterstroke ever made by a US president. But what can I say? Virtually no major country is willing to give in. On the contrary, there are fresh reprisals every day. And among all these reprisals, there is one that stands out above the rest and is causing rivers of ink to flow. Check it out.
China, Japan, South Korea will jointly respond to US tariffs, Chinese state media says.
That's right, there's nothing more unifying than having a common enemy, and now that enemy is clear, Donald Trump. Visualeconomik community, this may be a historic moment. China, South Korea, and Japan are three countries that typically get along like cats and dogs, and even to this day, they are still arguing over things that happened during the Second World War. And yes, it's true that this is not the first attempt at rapprochement, but let's be honest, with these three countries, every joint declaration was a case of one step forward and two steps back. But now, that may be about to change, all thanks to Donald Trump's tariffs. And let's see, we're certainly not going to see these countries suddenly becoming the best friends in the world. In fact, the Koreans have said that this headline, that they were planning a joint response against Trump, is an exaggeration, and from Tokyo, they have directly denied it. Nevertheless, this does not mean that there won't be a rapprochement. This meeting is the first economic dialogue in the last 5 years, and it's no coincidence that it's happening right now. So on Visualeconomik, we have asked a few questions. Are we looking at a new three-way alliance? Or is this just another statement with no real repercussions? What could all this mean for the US? And what about the rest of the Asian countries? Today on Visualeconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. Let's get started. Let me ask you a question. Which country do you think has the most US debt? Many of you will say China. After all, it's a massive country. But no, China is the second largest of US debt, the first being Japan. With this information, you can imagine the damage that an alliance between these two countries could do to the United States. But take note, because finance is not the only weak point that this alliance could attack. Far from it. The real Achilles heel of the US is critical technology, particularly semiconductors. You see, in 2023, Joe Biden's administration pulled out all the stops to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced microchips. And this measure worked very well. Semiconductor imports from the Asian giant plummeted. However, this story comes with fine print. While imports of microchips fell, the imports of the machinery used to convert rare earths into state-of-the-art microchips soared. And which country is the largest supplier of these machines to China? Exactly, Japan. In other words, China has a very strong incentive to get along with Japan. Xi Jinping has a very clear commitment to high technology. But the truth is that, so far, China has failed in its attempts to create a domestic semiconductor industry. We don't know if it will achieve this in the future, but until then, it will need to import chips and machinery from abroad. And here, Japanese machinery and chips from South Korea's Samsung are crucial. For the time being, China is already Japan's main trading partner. If we add imports and exports, China represents 10.5 trillion yen more than its second largest partner, the United States. Now, don't imagine that this means there's no friction between Japan and China. Nothing could be further from the truth. Despite the upturn in the sale of microchip manufacturing machinery, this sector remains tightly controlled, and conflicts between these two countries continue to be the order of the day. You want an example?
China keeps door firmly closed to Japanese seafood imports.
It sounds like a joke, but Japanese shrimp, for example, are strictly forbidden in China, and this has been the case since 2023. The reason? Well, as always, there is the official reason and the real one. The official one is that the Chinese authorities don't believe that Japanese seafood is safe, all because of the Fukushima nuclear incident. You see, a few years ago, Japan began discharging water from the Fukushima power plant into the sea, water that still contains radioactive elements from the 2011 tragedy. But let's face it, everyone knows this is a cheap excuse. Japan is going to dump a terrifying 0.5 gram of tritium into the sea every year for 30 years. You tell me what damage 0.5 gram can cause in the whole ocean. The reality is simply that these countries still get along poorly, and the Chinese authorities saw an opportunity to badmouth their neighbor and stir up anti-Japanese sentiment among their people. Look at how Japan pollutes our water and our food. In short, it illustrates how relations are still not the best in the world. But at least Japan and China are already talking about lifting, or at least easing, this restriction. It can be seen that in the face of Trump's threat, everything else is secondary. And no wonder, take a look at this graph. What you're looking at is the global trade imbalance. One thing is clear, China exports far more than it imports, and all that production is basically absorbed by the US. Or to put it another way, without the US, China will have a very difficult time selling its products. And yes, the US is not the center of the world and accounts for an increasingly smaller fraction of global GDP, but the problem is that other powers, such as Europe, are not so eager to consume, so China is left with two options. The first is to expand its domestic market, to have the Chinese themselves absorb all this production. This is one of Xi Jinping's goals, but it's a slow process and very complicated to carry out politically. And their second option is to look for other countries to offset US consumption. We've already seen that Europe is not very keen, but with the rest of Asia, it's a very different story. Take Vietnam, for example. Many Chinese companies are moving their factories there, exactly like American companies moving to China a couple of decades ago. These companies are basically looking for lower wages, but that's not all. As with China, Vietnam is not just a cheap factory. As it gets wealthier, its domestic market will also grow. It's a market that is ripe for Chinese companies, which need to replace the US at any cost. And take note, this is not just us talking, but it's what the Chinese authorities themselves say.
Facing the impact of U.S. tariff bullying, we have strong pressure resistance. In recent years, we have actively built a diversified market, and our dependence on the U.S. market has been declining.
Specifically, exports to the US have fallen from 19.2% in 2018 to 14.7% in 2024, while exports to other East Asian countries such as Vietnam have grown from 12.8% to 16.4%. Of course, replacing the US will be very complicated, but that is the direction in which Xi Jinping wants to take the country. But Xi Jinping is not the only one who wants to replace the US as a trading partner. South Korea and Japan are not very happy with Uncle Sam either, and the reason lies in one of their star sectors, automobiles. On top of all the tariffs on countries for their trade surplus, Trump has imposed another 25% tariff on vehicles and vehicle parts, a tariff that particularly hurts South Korea and Japan, which are the second and third largest exporters of automobiles to the US, behind only Mexico. To give some figures, last year, South Korea exported 2.8 million cars, half of which went to the US, and obviously, that massive market is at stake right now. What's more, this is not the first clash between these countries and the US. The Biden administration, for instance, vetoed Nippon Steel's purchase of US steel, citing national security concerns. Of course, like the case of Japanese seafood and China, this is just an excuse. The reality is that the government gave in to the blackmail of the unions and also thought that approving this purchase would not get them many votes. Whatever the case, I can assure you that this veto was no laughing matter in Tokyo. But anecdotes aside, the fact is that the macro situation in these countries is not at its best either. Japan recently approved one of the largest wage increases in 30 years with Rengo, the country's main labor union. However, almost all of this salary increase has been eaten up by inflation, which reached 4% between January 2023 and 2024. And yes, 4% after the pandemic is very little compared to the US or Europe, but remember that Japan is a country with a very serious deflation problem. This prompted the Bank of Japan to raise rates to 0.5%, which, again, in the US or Europe seems like a joke, but in Japan, this is a jump not seen since the 2008 crisis. But not surprisingly, the uncertainty generated by Trump's tariffs has made Japan decide to freeze rates. In other words, Trump's policies are preventing other countries from making policies to control their own economies. And something very similar has happened with South Korea, with an aggravating factor. South Korea has announced a $2 billion package to help the auto industry, and has also dropped a rate cut. Be that as it may, we're talking about very few measures, and they come very late, which is to be expected because the country is in the midst of political chaos due to the coup d'etat and subsequent trial of its prime minister. Let's face it, they don't have time to deal with Trump, and that makes the damage from tariffs even greater. Given all this context, I'm sure you already understand why this three-way alliance is so important, more important than ever. But of course, as much as this alliance would be great for their economies, the barriers separating these countries go far beyond economics. We've already talked a little about the conflicts between Japan and China, to which we must add other conflicts over waters or even entire islands. Even so, China is not the only problematic country. What's more, the relationship between Japan and South Korea may be a much bigger obstacle than the one they have with the Asian giant. The reasons are well known to you. Suffice it to say that Liberation Day is one of the country's biggest holidays, commemorating the anniversary of Japan's independence in 1945. The silver lining is that the rancor between these countries is diminishing over time, and the new generations appear to be much more open. For example, only 20% of Koreans over the age of 50 have a minimally positive image of Japan, compared to half of those under the age of 30. These are still very low figures, but hey, that's something. Nevertheless, keep in mind that young people participate very, very little in the politics of these two countries, so their opinion matters very little. What's more, one of the politicians most interested in repairing ties with Japan has been Yoon Suk-yeol, the same man who is now on trial for wanting to stage a coup d'etat. Still, there is reason for optimism, and that is that South Korea, Japan, and China already have an alliance. Meet the RCEP. The RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is a free trade agreement between 15 Asia-Pacific countries. We're talking about the largest agreement of its kind in terms of GDP, and it came into force in 2022. This agreement should not be confused with the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership from which the US withdrew. China has also asked to join this alliance, which, as well as Asia, involves American countries such as Canada, Mexico, Chile, and Peru, but for the moment it is waiting. And why is the RCEP so important? Because it could be the basis for a new agreement between China, South Korea, and Japan.
It is necessary to strengthen the implementation of RCEP, in which all three countries have participated, and to create a framework for expanding trade cooperation among the three countries.
At the moment, the RCEP eliminates 65% of tariffs, but this figure will not exceed 90% for another 20 years, so there's still room for improvement. On top of that, although the agreement attempts to regulate things like the digital market and services, there are still barriers that prevent these countries from being as strong a trading bloc as they would need to be if they are to wean themselves off dependence on the US. And who knows, maybe this is the first step toward an agreement that goes much further.
New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon is proposing the formation of a rules-based trading bloc in response to sweeping US tariffs.
There are already voices within the international arena calling for the creation of a unified trade bloc to combat Donald Trump's trade follies. Specifically, New Zealand's Prime Minister has proposed expanding the Trans-Pacific Agreement to include Europe. If this were to be fulfilled, and China were to be accepted into the CPTPP, then we could indeed be talking about a unified global bloc that would not need to depend on the US. Of course, as of today, this is all fantasy, but there are already proposals between China and Europe to liberalize the electric vehicle market, so you never know.
We uphold multilateralism and free trade and strive to develop economic blocs and globalization in a more inclusive direction.
Be that as it may, what is clear is that the world has not been silent in the face of Trump's trade war, and we're already seeing alliances that were unthinkable just a few years ago. To stop depending on the US is an enormous undertaking. There's no asset that can replace the role of the dollar and US debt, nor any other market so large that it can absorb the production of the rest of the countries. And it is precisely for this reason that we're seeing trade negotiations among other countries. But at this point, it's your turn. Will China, South Korea, and Japan overcome their differences and come to an agreement? Will we see a sort of merger between RCTP and CPTPP? Will East Asia be able to stop being so dependent on the US? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you next time. Take care. See you in the next one.